speaking engagement in New Orleans. I'm giving 5 talks in 3 days. I gave one at Tulane before, and I'm giving 2 tomorrow and 1 on Friday, was because the book was supposed to be published in February. So this was part of what was going to be a book tour. It was the Louisiana swing of a book tour, but then the book got delayed till April 19th. So as a result, I've got a tour with no book. I did get the advance copy yesterday, so I have a copy of the book, and I was actually just reading it out there in the hallway and trying to, like, you know, you write a book and then you forget what you wrote, and so it's kind of fun to read it again, and it's pretty good. We were just saying it's got book blurbs from Mark Levin and Bill Kristol and Jack Balkin from Yale and Senator Mike Lee of Utah were nice enough to write reviews and a foreword by George Will. So even though I don't have a book for sale, you can order it on Amazon now. You can pre-order it. It costs $18.10 for hardback. You can't beat that. It's like it's $13, I think, for Kindle. And so you might think about pre-ordering it. But let me explain to you why you should. That's what my talk's going to be. So I'm going to give you a summary of what I talk about in the book. Now, how many of you are lawyers or law students? 1, 2, 3. How many of you are economics people? This is the economics club, right? Okay. How many of you are something else? All right. So this book was written for a general audience. This book was not written for an expert. All my other books are academic books, Princeton, Harvard, Princeton, Oxford, for academic. This is a general audience book. And after I turned it in, after HarperCollins accepted it, they told me it's still too hard for a general audience. So I had to completely make it more accessible, added a lot of stories. In fact, the story that I start this talk with is added for this book. So hopefully this talk will be accessible. There's a few ideas I'm going to go through that might be a little harder for the non-lawyers, but by and large, this is an idea that all Americans can appreciate. It's basically about 2 different visions of the Constitution that have been in competition with each other all the way back to the beginning. But most people are not aware of this. So this is not something, because you're not a lawyer, you should not assume that lawyers are going to know what I'm talking about. This is a book for the American people, and for lawyers in particular, and for conservative lawyers in particular. Not that I assume you are conservative, but for conservatives to say how they've been misguided in how they've been looking at the Constitution as well. So let me start with my story. In 1789, James Madison had a problem. After living for 10 years under the Articles of Confederation, Madison had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring about a convention to devise a new constitution. In September of 1786, he participated in a preliminary convention in Annapolis, Maryland. By 1787, he had secured enough support of key players like George Washington and Ben Franklin to convene a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. Now, the pressure was on this 36-year-old Madison. He was only 36. Before journeying to Philadelphia, he crammed for the gathering like a student for his exams from a chest full of books that had been sent to him by his friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson. For the cerebral Madison had a truly fundamental problem to solve. Like many others, he had concluded that the American regime that was then governed by the Articles of Confederation was grossly inadequate and contrary to what the Virginia Declaration of Rights had referred to as, quote, the common benefit, protection, and security of the people. But why was this happening? Why had the republicanism of the founding generation had failed them so? For the previous 13 years, the people of the United States have been governed as 13 separate entities. State governments under the Articles of Confederation were thought to be Republican. The founders, and I should just emphasize, the name of this book is Our Republican Constitution. I didn't even say the name of the book. It's Our Republican Constitution. So this is a talk about what that means, Republican. For the previous 13 years, they'd been governed by 13 entities. State governments under the Articles were thought to be Republican. The founders had thrown off rule by an aristocratic few, the monarchy, in favor of rule by the democratic many. Or, if under aristocracy, the many are screwed by the few, The Democratic or Republican alternative was premised on the belief that the people won't screw themselves. This is, by the way, for those of you who are not lawyers, this is technical lawyers talk. Lawyers who were practiced law in Cook County, Illinois, anyway, as I did. I was a criminal prosecutor in Cook County, Illinois. So, but this Republican theory, the theory was the people won't screw themselves. That's the theory. It actually is a theory. That the people won't screw themselves had unexpectedly proven to be false. State legislatures began enacting debtor relief laws that both undermined the rights of creditors and impaired economic prosperity. It relieved debtors of having to pay their debts. And economic prosperity required a credit market. This is for the economists in the room. Economic prosperity required a credit market that can safely rely on the obligation of private contracts to collect from debtors. Otherwise, the whole thing kind of falls apart. States also began erecting a debilitating assortment of trade barriers, blocking free trade to protect their own business, protectionist measures to protect their own businesses from competing firms in neighboring states. The result of debtor relief laws and these protectionist measures is predictable from an economic standpoint, and that is an economic downturn. A big depression is what happened. A depression big enough to get people to think about changing the form of government. That's how bad the depression was. So Republican government, as it had then been conceived, was clearly not working for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people. But why not? To answer this question, in April of 1787, largely for his own benefit, Madison composed what's called an essay on the vices of the political system of the United States. It's an actually remarkable document. It's essentially a working paper that 36-year-old James Madison wrote for himself as he was prepping for the Constitutional Convention to try to figure out what had gone wrong, why had it gone wrong, and what should be done about it. So he's writing this essentially for his own benefit. In Vices, Madison identified the source of the problem in what he called the injustice of the laws of the state. So the problem was injustice in the laws of the state. The causes of this evil, he called it this evil, the causes of this evil, he contended, could be traced to the representative bodies in the states and ultimately to the people themselves. This, he wrote, called into question, quote, the fundamental principle of Republican government, that the majority who rule in such governments are the safest guardians both of the public good and of private rights. So what had happened had called that into question. Madison concluded that what we must be far more realistic about popular majorities. All civilized societies, he explained, quote, are divided into different interests and factions, as they happen to be creditors and debtors, rich or poor, husbandmen, merchants, or manufacturers, members of different religious sects, followers of different political leaders, inhabitants of different districts, owners of different kinds of property, etc. We're all divided up along multiple dimensions. In a democracy, the debtors outnumber the creditors, and the poor outnumber the rich. The larger group can simply outvote the smaller group. The majority, however composed, he continued, quote, ultimately give the law. Whenever, therefore, an apparent interest or common passion unites a majority, what is to restrain them from unjust violations of the rights and interests of the minority or of individuals, of even a single individual? To illustrate this problem, Madison proposed the following thought experiment, quote, place 3 individuals in a situation where the interest of each depends on the voice of the others, and give to 2 of them an interest opposed to the rights of the third. Will the latter be secure? So give 2 of them, of the 3 people, an interest different than the third, and let them vote on it. How well is the third person going to fare in that situation? He said, quote, the prudence of every man would shun the danger. Likewise, he asked, will 2,000 in a like situation be less likely to encroach on the rights of 1,000? In short, under the democratic version of republicanism, there is nothing stopping a majority of the polity from engaging in self-dealing at the expense of the minority. Madison concluded that what was needed was nothing less than a new Republican form of government that would address the weakness of democratic state governments while preserving popular sovereignty. Now, Madison was not alone in locating the ills facing the nation in the majoritarian democracy of the states. At the Philadelphia Convention, Edmund Randolph, our first Attorney General of the United States under George Washington, observed that, quote, the general object meaning here in Philadelphia, the general object was to provide a cure for the evils under which the U.S. labored. And in tracing these evils to their origin, every man had found it in the turbulence and follies of democracy. Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts stated, quote, the evils we experience flow from an excess of democracy. Roger Sherman of Connecticut contended that the people, quote, immediately should have as little to do as may be about the government, unquote. Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania noted that, quote, every man of observation has seen in the Democratic branches of the state legislatures precipitation, in Congress changeableness, in every department excesses against personal liberty, private property, and personal security. Now, even those who remained more amenable to democracy, like George Mason of Virginia, admitted that, quote, we had been too democratic in forming state governments. So that's what they saw as the problem. Democracy was the problem. At the conclusion of the convention, anxious citizens gathered outside Independence Hall to learn what had been produced behind closed doors. The convention deliberated entirely in secret. It was sweltering hot in the summertime, but they couldn't open the windows for fear somebody passing by would hear what they were saying. It is said that as Benjamin Franklin left the building, a woman in the crowd asked him, well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? Franklin is said to have responded, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. Mm-hmm. But while the new form of government devised in Philadelphia was not a monarchy, neither was it democratic. Yet Franklin still called it a republic. This was because the meaning of that term, republican or republic, had just been modified by the men in the building from which Franklin was leaving. A Republican Constitution was no longer a democratic one, if it ever truly was. So in my book, Our Republican Constitution, I identify these two fundamentally divergent views of the Constitution which I contend divide us to this day. I call these divergent views the Democratic Constitution and the Republican Constitution. But I don't intend these labels to be partisan. There are political conservatives who hew to aspects of the Democratic Constitution, and in large part this book is aimed at those conservatives. And some progressives who hew to aspects of the Republican one. Many people, maybe most people, flit between conceptions depending on which happens to conform to the results they like. I contend that what divides those who adhere to a Democratic Constitution from those who favor a Republican Constitution are two fundamentally inconsistent views of we the people, the first three words of the Constitution, we the people, that lead to two radically different conceptions of popular sovereignty. Those who adhere to the Democratic Constitution hold a different conception of we the people and popular sovereignty than those who adhere to a Republican Constitution. So before describing the specific differences between the Democratic Constitution and the Republican Constitution, let me begin by explaining the role that popular sovereignty plays in our thinking about the Constitution. The concept of popular sovereignty was developed in the United States at the time of our founding. Back then, it was a first principle of political theory that sovereignty, or the right to rule, must reside somewhere in any polity. So if you were doing politics or political theory, you had to say who was the sovereign. It was a requirement of political theory. While the ultimate sovereign was thought to be God, who ruled the world, on earth, monarchs claimed to be the sovereign rulers of their own people, ruling by delegation from God, or what is known as by divine right. When the Americans held their revolution and rejected the rule of the English king, political theory required them to say, well, just who is sovereign in your new polity? The answer they gave was, the people themselves are the ultimate sovereign. But this raises at least as many questions as it answered. If sovereignty is the answer to the question of who has the right to rule, in what sense do the people rule? This seems like a contradiction. We need government to rule the people, and yet the people themselves are supposed to be the ultimate ruler. Now, what I'm calling the democratic constitution is one way to address the problem of how the sovereign people can be said to rule. When we the people is viewed collectively, or as a body, or a group, then popular sovereignty means rule by the people as a body, or as a group. When by rule by the people, I mean rule by the people according to the will or desire of the people. The sovereign king rules by his will or desire, and the people rule by their will and desire. That's what popular sovereignty means under this view. Now, of course, it makes perfect sense to talk about the will or desire of an individual sovereign. People have wills and desires. But what sense does it make to say that a body of individual persons has a collective will or a desire? What is the desire, the collective will or desire, for example, of all the people in this room right now? Except maybe to regret your decision to come to this lecture, I don't know. But I mean, other than that, what would it be? No one who makes assertions about the will of the people ever claims that there must be, or ever can be, a unanimous consensus of everyone to some particular desire. So in practice, the collective will of the people must rest on the desires of who? A majority of the people, a supermajority of the people, or a supermajority of the people, but that's the only way it can work. Talk about the will of the people as a group, you must be talking about what a majority of the people want. It's just natural. So the democratic constitution starts with a collective vision of popular sovereignty based on the will of the people as a group, and the will of we the people can then only be that of a majority or a greater number. According to this conception, a legitimate constitution is a democratic constitution that sets up institutional mechanisms by which the desires of a majority of the people can be expressed. And from this premise, a number of very important implications follow. First and foremost, any principle or practice that gets in the way of the will of the majority or majority rule is presumptively illegitimate and requires special justification. Under the democratic constitution, the only individual rights that are legally enforceable are a product of majoritarian will. Either the will of majorities in the legislature who create legal rights, or the will of majorities who ratify the Constitution and create constitutional rights. So under the democratic constitution, first comes government, and then comes rights. First, one needs to establish a polity with a legislature that represents the will of the people, and then this legislature will decide which rights get legal protection and which do not. Under the democratic constitution is a living constitution, whose meaning evolves to align with contemporary popular desires, so that today's majority is not bound by what's called the dead hand of the past. After all, by what right does the will or desires of yesterday's majority override the will of the majority today? Under the democratic constitution, unelected judges who are not accountable to the majority present what Alexander Bickel has called the CounterMajoritarian Difficulty. Judges are not selected to represent the desires of anyone. They are appointed, not elected, and in the federal system they serve for life. To the extent they invalidate popularly enacted laws, these unelected and unaccountable judges are thwarting the will of the people as manifested in their elected representatives. Under the democratic constitution, judges are told that they should exercise their power of judicial review with restraint. They should defer to the will of the popularly elected branches by adopting a presumption of constitutionality that simply presumes, and perhaps irrebuttably presumes, that properly elected legislatures have acted properly when they restrict the liberties of we the people. For the people are only restricting themselves, we are told, and how they wish to govern themselves is for their democratically selected representatives to decide. So today, the belief in the democratic constitution is so pervasive amongst both progressives and conservatives, amongst Democrats and Republicans, even amongst some libertarians, that you might be sitting there wondering, well, what other view of the Constitution could there be? I try to describe the Democratic Constitution so fairly and accurately that it would describe what most people in this room believe. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm not trying to hide the ball. This is just a philosophy of we the people that I would think most people believe. So perhaps the most important purpose of this talk and of my book is simply to identify and describe for you the other view, what I'm calling the Republican Constitution, so that you can recognize it as a distinct vision of the Constitution. You don't have to agree with it, but at least you can see there is an alternative to the Democratic Constitution. Now, what separates the Republican Constitution from the Democratic Constitution is its conception of popular sovereignty. Where the Democratic Constitution views sovereignty as residing in we the people collectively or as a group, the Republican Constitution views sovereignty as residing in we the people as individuals. We the people as individuals. Or as I say, and I'll say repeatedly in this talk, we the people, each and every one. This individualist conception of popular sovereignty was most strikingly presented in the first great constitutional case decided by the Supreme Court in 1793, just 4 years after the Constitution was enacted. The case is Chisholm versus Georgia, and I can assure those of you who are not lawyers that most people who are lawyers don't know anything about this case. I certainly didn't know hardly anything about this case until a colleague of mine urged me to read it maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It's because it's not really taught in constitutional law. It's taught in federal courts, and it's only taught for a specific reason, which I don't need to get into. It's taught because it explains where the 11th Amendment to the Constitution came from, to reverse this case. Other than that, you don't need to know it. So it's not something anybody knows about. So I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because it actually was the first big, momentous Supreme Court case. So big and momentous that a constitutional amendment was passed to change the outcome. That's how big it was. But let me tell you what happened in Chisholm versus Georgia. It's actually a very simple case on the facts. Chisholm involved a lawsuit brought against the state of Georgia by a citizen of South Carolina. It was a suit for breach of contract to pay for goods that had been supplied to Georgia during the Revolutionary War. And then Georgia didn't want to pay for it later, after the war was over. But the state of Georgia, after being sued by this citizen of South Carolina, asserted that it had sovereign immunity from such a suit and refused even to appear in the Supreme Court to defend itself. So you have a citizen of South Carolina suing the state of Georgia. Article 3 of the Constitution suggests that the federal courts have jurisdiction to hear suits against a state by a citizen of another state. So Chisholm sues Georgia in the Supreme Court, and Georgia refuses to show up, won't even show up, because it says, we are a sovereign state, we have sovereign immunity, you cannot sue us, and we don't even recognize the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to hear this case. So what does the Supreme Court do? In Chisholm, by a vote of 4-1, there were only 5 justices back in the day. Not 9 like today, or 8 like we have right now, just 5. So there was only 5 justices, and in Chisholm, by a vote of 4-1, they rejected Georgia's assertion of sovereign immunity. Rejected it. The majority concluded instead that members of the public could sue state governments because sovereignty rests with the people as individuals rather than with the states. Why? Now, why they decided this is really interesting. I'm going to talk about 2 of the opinions in the case. One little difference about then and now. Now we have opinions of the court, and these opinions become very sacrosanct, and everybody reads the opinions very carefully because they provide a rule of law. That was a practice initiated by our 3rd Chief Justice, John Marshall. Prior to that, opinions of the Supreme Court were made or given what's called seriatim, or 1 by 1. That meant what would happen is the Supreme Court justices would vote, and then each justice would give their opinion as to why they voted that way. So you'd have 5 justices, you'd have 5 opinions. And the opinions themselves would not be law. They would just be the reasons that justice voted that way. It was John Marshall who initiated opinions of the court, and now, from that day until this day, we pore over the written opinions because they become a law. The opinions themselves, rather than just an opinion. Anyway, so I'm going to read to you 2 opinions. These are not opinions of the court. They're just opinions of the justices, 2 of the 4 justices who were voting in the majority against Georgia. The first one was by Justice James Wilson. Now, Justice James Wilson is our most forgotten and overlooked founder. He was one of the most influential persons in the Philadelphia Convention. He was an esteemed lawyer. He gave the series of lectures on jurisprudence in Philadelphia that President Washington attended, all the dignitaries in Philadelphia, which was the nation's capital at the time, attended. He was a really big deal. He's almost completely forgotten today. But to this time, he was Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In question and answer, I could talk to you more about James Wilson and maybe why he became forgotten. But he's a very neglected thinker. He wrote his lecture, he published his lectures on jurisprudence, and they're very, very interesting. At any rate, and in fact, his opinion in Chisholm versus Georgia was based on his lectures in jurisprudence. He kind of, like academics, he sort of recycled his lectures into his judicial opinions to give it greater currency. So that's one reason why his opinion is so long. So I'm going to do a very brief rendition of Wilson's opinion. In Wilson's opinion, he contended that first of all, he notes the term sovereignty, which we make so much about, doesn't even appear in the Constitution. Now, one reason he might have emphasized that is that he was on the committee of detail that actually penned the draft of the Constitution. He had to select the words, and he had personal knowledge that they didn't put the word sovereignty in there. If it was to be used at all, he said, however, he said it should be referred to the individual person. Quote, laws derived from the pure source of equality and justice must be founded on the consent of those whose obedience they require. The sovereign, when traced to this source, must be found in the man, the individual, not the group. In other words, obedience must rest on the consent of the individual person who is asked to obey the law. Wilson believed that the only reason, quote, a free man is bound by laws is that he binds himself, unquote. For Wilson, states, like Georgia, were nothing more than an aggregate of free individuals, a group of free individuals. He said, if one free man, an original sovereign, may bind himself to the jurisdiction of the court, why may not an aggregate of free men, a collection of original sovereigns, do this likewise? If the dignity of each singly is undiminished, the dignity of all jointly must be unimpaired. What does that mean? It means if our dignity as a member of the sovereign public is undiminished by us having to go and appear in front of a judge when we're sued, then the dignity of this group of people making up this government of Georgia is also undiminished if they have to show up in court. We're just people. We're just they're an aggregate of sovereigns, of individual sovereigns, and we're one sovereign. So we're all equal, and we should all be able to we should all have to go to court if the court has jurisdiction. Now, Justice Wilson was not alone in identifying sovereignty in the individual person. In his opinion in Chisholm, Chief Justice John Jay, our first Chief Justice, who with Madison and Hamilton had authored some of the earliest Federalist papers, referred tellingly in his opinion to, quote, the joint and equal sovereigns of this country. We would all be the joint and equal sovereigns of this country, as well as he also referred to fellow citizens and joint sovereigns. We're fellow citizens, we're joint sovereigns. And then he also referred to that popular sovereignty in which every citizen partakes, which then clearly connected this joint sovereignty concept with the term popular sovereignty. He expressly uses popular sovereignty, so I'm not distorting things when I say that's what he's talking about. Now, Justice Wilson and Jay's individual, and I talk much more about this in the book than I just did, but this is the short version. Justice Wilson and Jay's individualist concept of popular sovereignty presents the radical, yet fundamental idea that if anyone is sovereign, it is we the people as individuals, we the people, each and every one of us, in the citizenry as a whole, rather than in what? Rather than in a majority of the electorate. It's each and all of us. Okay, fine. I gave you the implications of the democratic constitution, the collective vision of popular sovereignty. What are the implications of this individualistic conception of we the people? What follows from that? I contend that an individual conception of popular sovereignty yields a republican rather than a democratic constitution. The theory of what I'm calling our Republican Constitution was quite clearly expressed in the Declaration of Independence, which stated that every person has a natural and inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You all know that. That's the only part of the Declaration that people do know. And then the next sentence it says, it is to secure these rights that governments are instituted among men. So for what sentence, first sentence, it's not the first sentence, it's down in there. Sentence says, everybody has inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Second, next sentence, to secure those rights, and those rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are all individual rights. Individuals' right to life, individuals' right to happiness, pursue happiness. It is to secure those individual rights, says the next sentence, that governments are instituted among men. So the proper measure of any government is how well it protects those individual rights. So under a Republican Constitution, first comes rights, and then comes government. Remember under the Democratic Constitution? First comes the polity, and then they vote. The legislature votes and creates legal rights, and that's where you get your rights from. Or they make a constitution, and that's where you get your rights from. But under this conception, first comes rights, and then comes government to secure these rights. Under the Republican Constitution, because the people consist of each and every person, the power to govern must be delegated to some subset of the people. Those people who are in government are not all of us, it's just a handful of people. Georgetown Law is not actually where Georgetown University is, it's over on Capitol Hill near Union Station, within sight of the Capitol. We walk out the front door, we look up, and there's the Capitol Dome. In that Capitol are 535 people who are either representatives or senators. 435 representatives, 100 senators. That's who they are. They are not us, they are not you, they are not me. They are 535 fellow citizens and joint sovereigns. That's who they are, a subset. And they are not to be confused with the people themselves. They are not us. They are not to be confused with us. We, the people, are the principals. We, the people, are the principals, or masters, and they are our servants. You may have actually heard that phrase, government servants. I know it sounds kind of archaic. It sounds kind of unrealistic, but that's the theory. We are the masters and they are the servants. As agents of ours, they are to govern on our behalf and also subject to our ultimate control. That's standard agency law for those of you who do law work. Now, to ensure that these servants remain with what the Declaration says are their just powers, let me just finish that sentence. It is to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Not any power, not all power, not unlimited power, not whatever power, they're just powers. So governments only have just powers, and to ensure that those 535, or the people here in the legislature of Louisiana, stay within their just powers, their lawmaking powers must itself be limited by law. We are limited by law. We have speeding laws and all kinds of laws that limit us, what we can do. And they are limited by law. Their powers must also be limited by law. The Republican Constitution is that law. The Republican Constitution provides the law that governs those who govern us. It's the law, this right here.